Hello everyone, my name is Brian, and today I'm going to show you how to develop a user interface to interact with the SQLiteDatabase in an Android application. This tutorial is part 2 of a two-part tutorial series that covers using a local database in an Android application. Now, if you've been following along so far, in the previous part of this series, we created the back-end code for the SQLite database. We were able to create the database and as well create functions to access the database. Now that we've created these functions and we have this database, we can use these functions to call and access the database on the front end or on the user interface end. So for this tutorial, we're going to use a fairly simple inventory application, and with it we'll have a fairly simple UI. So first off, we're going to look at your main.xml that you're going to create. Basically all we have here is just an item name input where they put the name of the item, a quantity input, an add item button, an update item button, a delete item button, and a view database button. Now all of these buttons are going to share one on-click method that we'll discuss later, and we'll be using a switch case to switch between which button was in fact clicked. But if you look over to the code here for the main.xml, we should have a text view right here, and for the title to identify that that's where you input the item name. As well, there's one for the quantity, and there's an edit text for both of these inputs. A lot of this stuff by this time, you've probably seen a lot of this so far, so it's really just adding two edit texts, two text views, and then the buttons that correspond to each of them. So you have an add item button, the update item, the delete item, and the view data. And like I said, their on-click methods are just going to be the on-click method. Okay. So once you have that, another thing to note, you don't have to, you could just use a direct value, but since I used for the names of these headings, I used some of the value, I set up my own values in the string.xml. So if you're following exactly the way I did it, you just want to add item name, string value, as well as quantity. Similar to the other components, you probably have seen a lot of this so far. Okay, so now onto the database or the data view. Now this is extremely simple page where all it is we're just going to output the database as a table, just in plain text. And so all it really involves is a text view. So just pop the text view in there, give it whatever ID you need to, and that's our data view.xml. Okay, cool. So we're also going to create now, to correspond with these two views, we're going to need activities in the background. So the activities we're going to create for this time are database manager activity, which is going to handle all of the user input, and which corresponds to main.xml, and the database viewer.java. Now, before we go ahead and code any of this, we're going to want to actually look at the Android manifest.xml. When you're working with multiple activities and you want to switch between them, you have to set the actions that are taken and the name so that you can order to change the intent filters, essentially, so that you can change between each different activity. So you're just going to go ahead to the Android manifest, and within the application tags, you're going to add activity, and then Android name, database manager activity, and then Android label, string, and then app name. And then closing activity tag, and within that you're going to add an intent filter, and the action is going to be android.intent.action.main, and the category is going to be Android name, android.intent.category.launcher. Now it's really important to have the main action, or having one of your activities have a main action, because it needs to know what to load when you actually load the application. So you want obviously the input page to show up first. And then the data viewer page you set up similar to above, except the action will be Android tutorials.database.local.view, and category will be android.intent.category.default. So category really doesn't matter with it. It's just you normally set it to default, and I gave it my own name, view. So this is actually set by me. So then later on when I want to call that intent to switch to it, I can call it by this name, or this action name rather. Okay, cool. So in the interest of time, I went ahead and put in a lot of stuff, because there is a lot of kind of little kind of unimportant details that I thought I'd get through and I could just explain to you very quickly. So first of all, we're going to move to the major chunk of this tutorial, which is the database manager activity. So since it is an activity, we have to extend activity, and therefore we should import activity. As well, as we go through here, I'll import any of the libraries we need. But so this is basically, like I said, you're going to handle all the input, the user input into the database, or any of the buttons, basically, any of the user interaction. Okay, so we're going to have to set up some variables. First off, we're going to need to create the input, a variable or an object that will correspond to the input box for the name, which will be the type input. So we're going to have to import edit text. All right, cool. And then we're also going to need a database control. So if you remember in the last tutorial, we created a database control object. This is where we're going to actually utilize it so that we can use the SQL functions we created. So we're going to call that DB control. All right, great. Now, since it's an activity, we have to have an onCreate method. So we're going to just use this a standard onCreate method that passes in a bundle, and we're also going to have to import bundle. All right, so in here, all we're going to do is send to the superclass. We're going to send the bundle. As well, we're going to set the content view to the main layout because we want it to correspond with the user input layout that we've created. We're going to instantiate a new database control object, and we're going to pass this as the context. As well, we're going to set the input to the edit text. So you guys probably seen this before in previous tutorials. You find the view by ID and get the corresponding ID of the view you created. I think for ours, we had for the item input, it was item type, and quantity for the quantity input one. And you just save those in the variables that you created up above. Okay, great. Now, here comes the lengthy part. We needed an on-click for all of these buttons, and we need them to do certain things depending on what is written on the button. Now, we could have multiple on-click methods, and we could have mapped all of the views to different on-clicks, but just to simplify it a little bit, we're going to put this all in one on-click method, and we're going to check what view was calling this on-click. And to do that, you actually look at the argument passed to the on-click method. We'll refer to the actual view that was calling the on-click. So we're going to need to import view as well. And might as well go ahead and import the rest of these. We're going to need to import dialog because we're going to want a dialog box, basically a pop-up window to tell people, or to tell the user whether or not something was successful, something failed, what happened as we're adding or taking things out of the database. As well, we're going to need a text view to put inside that dialog. So we're just going to have to import text view. Okay, now, so I'll go through these variables that I've set up right here. The data that we have, we want to be able to grab the name that they've inputted into the text. So once they input text and they press the button, we'll read this text that was in there and basically do something with it. So we're going to take the type input. So type input refers to the text or the name input box. And we're going to get the text. Now, this is kind of a lengthy chain I've got here. We're going to get the text, but we're going to turn it into a string. We're going to get the toString of that. And then once we've gotten that, then we're going to actually have to, well, it's a better idea to put it into a lowercase so that, say, if someone puts a book in and they actually put a capital B, O-O-K, but then later on they put book in with no capital B, it should be the same item. You shouldn't have multiple items with like the same name with different cases. So this ensures that all input is automatically put to lowercase before it's put into the database. And alternately, when it's read from the database, it will, since it was put in, you can, or since it was put in lowercase and it's being read, or it's being compared in lowercase, then that way you're ensure that you're not making multiple of the same object. Okay, so quantity data is we're just going to get text for this one, no lowercasing for this. We're just going to get it as a string, which we'll later have to convert to a actual integer when we want to actually change the quantity in the database. Okay, and as I said, we're going to have a dialog. We'll just call it notice, which equals a dialog, and then the context will be this. Also, we're going to take a text view. The text view will be inside the actual dialog box. We're just going to call it message body, and we're going to go equals new text view this. And we'll just set the text size of the message body to 20, just so it kind of stands out a lot, but it's not too big. Also, we're going to need a temporary value, so you're going to have to go long temp val equals 0. So that's going to be used actually to store the result of the resulting ID that comes back from our query. Okay, so like I said, we're going to use a switch case. We're switching on the ID of the view that's being passed. So we take the argument that was being passed, arg, and then we use the function getID that will return the ID for that view. And we're going to basically switch case on, depending on that, so depending on which button is clicked. So I'm going to go through it for each button at a time and kind of explain them. I've set up some code here just to save some time, like I said. For each of them, because of the exceptions that are thrown, whether it be from SQL or from potentially trying to convert quantity, say, that someone inputted that isn't in a number, there's going to be a lot of exceptions we have to deal with, and then appropriately notify the user of the error. Okay, so first off, we're going to look at add item. Okay, so go ahead and create a try catch block and create an exception. We're just going to have to import SQLite exception. Create a catch that'll catch an SQLite exception and one that will catch a number format exception. Now, you don't need to print the stack trace. I just did it for possibly debugging. It might help you out later on. But really what we want to do is, if it's, say, an SQL error that happened when you're trying to add an item into the database, you should set the title and the text of the message box or of the dialog so that it reflects that there's been an error and that the insert failed. Similarly, the insert should fail. The insert fails as well if, for example, the quantity that someone tried to add, they put in hello instead of putting in a number. The number format exception will fail when you try and convert the quantity input into an integer, which we will do in the try block. And then at the very end of this, we're just going to do notice.setContentView. So this sets the text view to the actual input or the dialog box, and then we show the dialog and it pops up. Okay, so now that we've covered basically the wraparound of this code, we're going to go into and actually do the logic required. Okay, like I said, we're going to need to take the quantity input and actually convert it into a number so we can do anything with it. So we're going to have a variable called quantity data as num. It's going to be an integer, and it's going to, you're going to call integer.parseInt, and you're going to pass in the quantity data. Okay, so now we have the actual integer representation of the quantity. Okay, so now since we're doing an operation on the database, like I had said in the previous tutorial, we need to open and close the database when we use it. So right now we're going to open up the database. We're going to use the database control that we set up above and do dbcontrol.open. And now if an SQLite exception is thrown, it'll be caught like we've done down there. Okay, now we're going to need to create some if and else logic for handling different conditions. So we want to check before we try and add an item whether or not it already exists in the database. If it does, we should update rather than actually add a new item. So in order to check this, we can use the function we defined earlier on that tries to fetch an item by type. So what we're going to do is if and then temp val equals dbcontrol dot fetch item ID by type, and we're going to pass in the type data. So for example, if someone tries to input a book and there already exists a book in the database, or the book item into the database, then this function will return something, and therefore not returning negative 1, and will go into this if statement. So this is the condition as if there's something already exists, then we want to update it. So we're going to have another condition in here to make sure that the update in fact works. We're going to do if db dot update item, pass in temp val, type data, and quantity data as num. Oops, db control. Okay, so this is the ideal situation. The update worked, so we're gonna notify them that the update worked, and to do that, we're gonna modify the text of the message box. So we're just gonna say something like item updated, and so that's gonna set the title of the text box, and oops, sorry, the message body. I'm going to set the text of the message body to something like item already existed, therefore was updated instead. So this lets the user know that the item already did exist, so instead of adding a new item, it just updated the quantity to the quantity they had inputted in the actual input field. Now, otherwise, you always want to make sure that if the update somehow didn't work, then what you want to do is, well, in other words, if it didn't update anything, that means somehow there was no items in there. It may seem like you may never run into this error, but it's always good to make sure you've covered all your bases. So if it didn't work, we want to set the title to update failed. And we want to change the message body to set text to item already existed, update attempted, but failed. You might want to choose a less robotic response, but just for now, that'll work. Now, this is all under the assumption that the item already exists. Now, if it didn't exist, we have to make the else condition. So this is if it doesn't already exist, we want to add it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go long row ID equals 0. We're going to create a variable. This will store the resulting ID that happened or that occurs from adding the item. So now we're going to go row ID equals db control dot add item, and we're going to pass in the type data and the quantity. And remember, it has to be quantity as number, or quantity data as number, because the database only takes it in as an integer, as we define it. And also, like above, you want to set the title so so the user knows that the item was in fact inserted, not updated. So just item inserted for the title, and message body. Say something like the item was inserted at this row. So item inserted at, and then pass the row ID. So then this tells the user that it was inserted at this row. I mean, you don't need to show this. This is really good just as you're running your program to make sure it actually works. You can see that that it was inserted at this row, so you know that in the database it's at that row. Okay, cool. So now that we've finished all we need to do in terms of calls for this section or this case, we need to close the database. Actually, we should probably do that. Yep, sorry, inside the catch. I thought that was inside the catch. Okay, cool. Close the database, and we already have our exceptions done, and this will display the pop-up. So we're good for this. Now we can move on to updating. The thing about this is a lot of the code is going to be very reusable. So a lot of the code we've done so far, or we just did in this last section, we're going to use again. It may seem kind of redundant to do this, but by repeating some of the same scenarios and checking, you can react and tell the user what's happening. So it's a much more interactive UI, and the user is aware of what problems occurred, whether or not the update worked. So what we're going to actually do is we can take a lot of this code that we have already. So you can grab this all, and you can throw it down in here. So basically, now we're in an update situation. So the user had clicked the update item and they wanted to update this information. So we still want to do the check to see if the item actually exists in the database. If it does not, then there is nothing to update and we have to notify the user of that. If it does, then we try and update. And similarly, if the item doesn't update, then we notify, if the item update failed, then we notify them of that as well. So we already have the same code from before where we check if the item exists. Now inside here, we might want to change the wording of the messages so that it portrays a little bit better what actually is happening. So instead of saying our item already existed, since this is actually just an update, not a create attempt, we're going to go item has been updated. And instead, if it failed, just say something like failed update attempt, no records found. Okay, so we probably wouldn't have gotten to this block if there weren't any, if there actually weren't any records to update, but like I said, you always want to be safe. So now if there wasn't any record, so if in fact it returns -1, then it couldn't find anything, then what we want to do is notify the user that the update failed and the items did not exist. So I'm going to go notice.set title update failed and message body.set text item does not exist. Okay, cool. So now, just before we leave out of this, we want to make sure we remember to close the database. So just call it close on that. Okay, cool. So it was very similar to the add. Now we just got to move on to the delete, which will be copying some of the same code, but will be even less actually than prior. So we don't actually, in a delete situation, all we need is the row ID. We don't care about the quantity. We're just going to completely delete that row. So we don't have to worry about the number format exception. So unlike above where we had both an SQL exception and a number format exception, we only need an SQLite exception. So what we want to do here is copy a lot of the similar code, copy that check to see if the item actually exists. Because if there is no item, we don't want to delete it, or there's nothing really to delete. So you might want to actually just copy the whole thing, including the open. Okay, cool. So now that you have the code from up top where you check if the item actually exists, in this situation we don't want to update, but rather we want to delete this time around. So we want to call delete item, and we want to pass in the resulting ID that we got from a successful fetch. And I might have too many braces here. Brackets rather. Okay, cool. So like above, if there is an item found, we enter into this block, and this time we want to say item deleted, and something like item has been deleted. Again, I'm doing really simple messages. You guys can make them more elaborate, or you can have a totally different warning system. But just for a simple warning system, it's easy. Just have a simple pop-up that notifies the user of what happened. Now, if the delete failed for some reason, even though our fetch found that there was an item in the database, then we want to notify them. and we're just going to go failed delete attempt. No records found. Now for if the delete, if there was no objects or no items rather in the database to delete, then we want to notify them that as well. So that's going to be in the else. So delete failed, and you can just say item not exists or no such records exist. And then you want to close the database. And similar as above, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but since you have the exceptions in all of the different cases, you might, you can keep the actual error message itself because it portrays what's going on, but maybe you want to instead add for the title, say update failed or delete failed, depending on which scenario you're in. Okay, so then after you have the exception that's been, we've already written the caught exception, then you just add the code right here to set the content of the pop-up and then actually show the pop-up. Okay, so a lot of copying and pasting. Final case is actually very, very small and is unlike any of the other ones. This is the view data button. So this is when you want to switch to the other activity and actually view the data in the database as kind of like a simple text table. So for this class, all we're going to do is actually switch to the other, switch into the other intent, or switch the intent so that we're actually looking at the other activity. So I had named it Android tutorials.database.local.view. Okay, so now we want to start the activity. So just pass in the intent. And there you go. That's all the code that we actually have to do for this class. So now we can move on to the other class in this project. Okay, so now we're going to actually move back to the onto the simpler class of this tutorial, which is the database viewer. And as well, this also extends activity. So what we're going to need to do is extend activity and import obviously the library as well. We're going to be catching an SQLite exception here because we're also going to be opening when we're making requests to the database and closing. As well, we're going to need to import bundle. Okay, so I just set up some basic stuff in here. Since it's an onCreate method, we have to call to the super onCreate, just pass the bundle like we've done previously. We're going to set the context view to the data view as layout as opposed to the main.xml. Okay, so now the next step is we want to create a text view item or object. And so that we can map it to the text view object that's already on our data view layout. So we're going to cast into text view. We're going to find view ID like we've done so many times before. And we go r.id.data output. And we're just going to need to import the text view. So import that text view. Okay. So also we're going to have to set up our database control objects. So database control, and we'll call this control equals new database control, and we're going to pass this as the context of this object or this class. Okay, and since we want to output it as, or output the result of the database as a basic text table, we want to have headings for the table. So we're gonna append all the results to one string. We'll just call that string result. But first we're gonna want to have these headings. So just set up something simple corresponding to the actual column names in the original database, just so it it's easier to read. So we're gonna put ID and then put a tab in there, or underscore ID and then a tab, then a space, item type, and then a tab, and then a space, and quantity. Now, because we're just playing around with strings and you might have some inputted words that are longer than others, it's not necessarily going to line up perfectly, but it'll at least show the data in a fairly structured table. Now, within the try catch, all we're doing is we're going to open up the database, control.open. We're going to have result equal to itself, and then concatenate just an empty string plus the control.fetch all items. That was the database function we had defined earlier that will just take all the results of the database and return them as an organized table string. And then we just want to close the database. And then we just want to set the content of the text view. So since content was the name of our text view that in our data view.xml, we're just going to go content.setText, and we're just going to set it to the result that we got. And there you go. You now can output the contents of the database to a basic text view so you can see what's actually going on inside the database. Now, if you want to, you could create another button to go back to the main activity. So if you want to switch easier, you could always just click back, which is what a lot of users would do if they want to return back to the main menu. So that'll still work even without adding the an intent change button of any form. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope you guys have learned enough to start adding an SQLite database, and hopefully this entire series has helped you with both the back and front end code required for setting up a local database in an Android application.